Hi friends, welcome to my channel Connecting with Littles. If you're new here, my name is Melinda, and I love to share the things that I have learned with other busy young moms like myself. Today I want to share a bit about accepting your birth story, or accepting the birth you get. I find as soon as one gets into the natural birth world, or studying into natural birth, you start to get a huge pressure to have a natural birth and that everything goes well, and somehow if you have to have a C-section or whatever, you're somehow less than. And I don't believe that's true, but I just wanted to bring the balance to that, because I do believe it is good to study all you can and to get all the information you can and to try to have a natural birth, and all the interventions that are unnecessary should be avoided. But what about the times that it is necessary to have a C-section, let's say, or to have some interventions? There shouldn't be shame in that. I think almost all women love to hear a good birth story, so I wanted to share a bit of mine. I have 4 children, 6 and under. My youngest is only 3 months old, and my husband and I have been married for 7.5 years. Maybe I should also share a bit about my pregnancy stories, just for encouragement for anyone who may need it, because I know I love to hear more perspectives, and it helped me to have a more balanced approach to my pregnancies and births. With none of my pregnancies, I have really had much nausea or throwing up. I've gotten very tired, and I've felt not well the first few months, but instead of not being able to eat, I need to be eating constantly, even if it doesn't taste very good, but eating something constantly. With my first one, I had panic attacks in the first 3 months. I guess it was suddenly realizing that I was leaving my youth. And as much as I'd always wanted to be a mom, it was scary. And I remember the first 3 months it was hard because I had quite a bit of panic attacks. But then they went away, and the rest of my pregnancy went very well. And I had always wanted that no one would find out when I was having my baby. That even the grandmas, even if it was the first grandchild for both grandmas, I didn't want them to find out. And it worked out perfectly. We went to bed one night, but I couldn't really go to sleep, and about midnight I went realizing, well, this must be labor, I guess. And for me, labor starts out not being painful. It's just small contractions, but they were getting consistent, and by the time I realized that it was actually labor, they were probably at least every 3 minutes apart or so. And so Marcos and I got ready, and we went to the hospital. Here in Costa Rica, where we live, there's private hospitals and midwives, but they are quite expensive, and we've never had a bad experience with our public hospital. And so we went there. Our first daughter was born at 7 in the morning after being in the hospital 3 or 4 hours. Those last 3 or 4 hours were really tough. I mean, they scared me. And I know I can't complain, because most first-time moms get much more than 3 to 4 hard hours. And I was not prepared for how hard labor could be, the intensity of it. But she was born and everything went fine. 16 months later, our second daughter was going to be born. That whole pregnancy, I felt really well physically, I think. I hardly had any issues. What made that pregnancy more difficult probably was having another little girl, another baby yet, and that we were building a house and moving in that pregnancy. The last few months, my husband was very busy building the house, and I was alone at home a lot of the time with my 1-year-old, and helping out whenever I could in the house building. And then we moved a week before she was born, and there was a flu going around, and the first night in our new house, which was very unfinished, that first night it didn't even have windows in, because the people had said they were bringing windows came late. But that first night I started throwing up. There'd been a flu going around that already my husband and my other daughter had gotten, and I started throwing up, and I was sick, and it was just so hard to think of going into labor in those conditions, or my husband's still weak from his sickness and our house the way it was and everything. And so I've and another thing I haven't mentioned is that because of those first 3 or 4 hours of hard labor, I was scared to go into labor again. So I spent my whole second pregnancy praying for a good birth, praying and asking for help and learning to relax. I have the book about the Bradley method, and that's pretty much by what I go by, and I think that has helped in my labors a lot. And so I would practice relaxing, and in that second pregnancy, if I would imagine a contraction, I'd almost go into panic again. But I practiced relaxing and imagining contractions till I could relax through imagining them. And so that time around her birth was so stressful. By the time she was born a week later, I was better already, but our house was still unfinished. The day she was born, we were moving the last of the things from our old house. There was dirt everywhere because there wasn't grass yet, and it all came into the house. A lot of boxes were still sitting around. I knew where the baby stuff was, but otherwise, it was probably one of the hardest weeks mentally for me. But then her labor ended up from the time I realized that I was actually in labor around 3 in the afternoon till she was born at 7, 4 hours, and I wouldn't say that labor was hard at all. I mean, labor is never easy, but it was just a little while in the less than an hour in the hospital, and I feel like that was God's grace to me in a time when it was so hard for me emotionally and mentally, with moving an unfinished house and having been sick and all the things. At the end of every pregnancy, I have to prepare myself mentally, but I do feel it took away a lot of the fear of labor, and I've always been grateful for that experience. In God's grace, her second name is Grace, and I feel like in her pregnancy, God's grace came through very clear because it was a hard time for me. When she was about a year old, we had a miscarriage, and I have a place in my heart for mamas who have miscarriages, but I don't feel like it was terribly hard emotionally for me. It was hard. I missed that baby, but I felt like I knew miscarriages were normal. I'd probably been prepared since the beginning of the pregnancy, since I never really felt sick or tired like I was used to. And so we found out through an ultrasound that there was no heartbeat, and the heart had probably stopped beating a couple weeks earlier already, and then a week or two later I lost the baby. I will not say that it was that hard for me. A bit over a year later, we had our third daughter. That pregnancy was my hardest. That one, from the time, from the time I was 7 or 8 weeks along, I don't have morning sickness. I don't struggle with nausea. But I have evening sickness, more like evening sickness, so I can still eat and don't throw up and all that. I would barely get supper on the table for my husband and my little girls and eat a bit, and I'd go lie down, and the dishes wouldn't get cleared from the table or anything that evening, at least for some months of the pregnancy. In the morning I would then feel much better, and then I'd do them then, and then as soon as my husband would leave for work, I'd put a sponge down in the living room and close the door so that my 1 and 2 year olds wouldn't wander off somewhere, and let them climb all over me, and I'd go to sleep for a while, and then I'd finally get up and work on my housework. That baby, my third baby, was by far my biggest and my most uncomfortable pregnancy. But I was at a otherwise much better stage of life because we were fairly settled in our house by then, so I could handle, I think, a lot of that much better. Her labor was, I can almost say, 2.5 days long, but it wasn't hard at all. I started on a Friday afternoon with contractions like that every 6 minutes, and when I told my mom and mother-in-law, they were almost figuring I'd have the baby the same day as fast as my last two had gone. But I knew they didn't feel strong at all. They were very consistent, but they didn't feel strong at all. And I had thankfully known not to prepare yourself for once you've had a fast birth that all your others will be fast. It might not. Maybe my daughter was a bit in the wrong position. Maybe it's because she was so big. But that labor sure took a lot longer. I went to sleep fine that night. All day Saturday it was with contractions like that. Sunday morning they had stopped for a while. Sunday afternoon they picked up again. And finally Sunday evening I started feeling like, okay, this is starting to get serious. But it's still not, I had enough experience and knew it was nothing. Oh, and another thing, that pregnancy, that third one, was during the first year of COVID. And the public hospitals at that time, thankfully, it was at the end of that first year, so by then they didn't have it that the dad couldn't be in at all, like if a few months earlier it would have been. But I was not going to go to the hospital because I'd have to be in the hospital all by myself, except for at the last few minutes they would call the dad in just for the birth and then he'd have to leave again. And so I would have gone in probably Sunday evening already. But I didn't care if I had to have the baby in the car or what. I wasn't going to be in the hospital so long alone. So I spent all night on my knees by the sofa. I'd have contractions every 6 minutes, but they were getting a bit harder, but they weren't like close. And I couldn't go lie in bed, but I could kind of sleep a bit between contractions. And so at about 4 in the morning, then we decided, well, it was time to go to the hospital. So we started getting ready. We had someone to come stay with the other girls, and we left. And I wasn't in the hospital more than 2 hours, and my third daughter was born. And so on one hand, it was a long labor, but I was mentally able to handle it. I don't know how I would have handled such a long labor with my second daughter in such a place, in the stage we were at that time, or in the stage I was at. So I always feel like God knew what I needed and what I could handle. When my third daughter was about a year old, I went through a harder time physically. I was having some thyroid issues. The numbers showed normal, but they were a bit on the low side. They were in the normal range. And so it took a bit longer, but eventually I had another baby. I love babies. All my babies have been waited for. And that pregnancy was by far my easiest, my last one, my fourth one. It was so easy that I was afraid I was having another miscarriage. And at 7 weeks or so, we went to get an ultrasound, and I expected to see no heartbeat. But there was a heartbeat. It was such a beautiful gift. Such an easy pregnancy. I didn't have the tiredness at other times. I didn't get, it was just easy. And then 3.5 months ago, I was getting tired. By the end of the pregnancy, I always do. But I was 38.5 weeks along. All mothers have been born 39 to 40 weeks. It was 38.5 weeks long. And we were having some meetings in our church. And so it was evening meetings every evening. And I skipped out on a meeting or two. I was getting quite tired by that time. But I figured the baby would probably wait a while. On the last evening of the meetings, my husband stayed there to help someone fix their vehicle, and I went home with the girls, and I put them to bed. I told my family something about it, didn't expect the baby would come the next day. And I went to bed. When my husband came home around midnight, I woke up and I started having this, it was like a full-time contraction. My tummy was hard, and it started hurting. It was getting hard for me to breathe, and I'm not used to that. I'm used to my labor start slow, and there was even no breaks in the contractions. So my husband was going to get a bit of sleep, but he had to take some people to the airport at 1:30, and that is right beside our hospital. It's half an hour, both of them half an hour from our place. And so we decided I might as well get ready and go get it checked out. And so we went, and when he was, but it kept getting harder and harder for me to, it was just this constant pain, contractions get worse and get better and get worse and get better, or whatever, stronger, lighter, however you want to call it. And here it was just pretty much a constant pain. And so we asked my in-laws to come sleep with the girls, and we were going to leave around 1:30. But then as we were leaving, I knew if this is gonna get any worse, this was feeling as bad as, I didn't know what was happening, but as bad as I had at the other times towards the end of the birth. So if it was going to take too long and the baby was going to be born in the vehicle, I wanted my husband available. I said, ask your dad to drive. And so he did, and we took the people to the airport, a vehicle full of people, and I knelt the whole way. And we got there, and I could hardly move, hardly walk anymore, but he dragged me into the hospital, my husband, and my father-in-law was able to take the people to the airport. Thankfully, they dropped us off before dropping the people off, because it almost would have worked better to drop them off first, but I said, no, dude, drop me off first. And we went in, and it went pretty quick, thankfully. I guess they maybe saw the state I was in. They checked me, and they said 1 centimeter dilated. And that was so hard for me to think of that, because all my others, by the time I'd gotten to the hospital, I was always 8 or 9 centimeters. And it hadn't been hard to that point. And if here at 1 centimeter it was so hard already, how was it going to handle a labor? A long labor? I didn't know. But then they checked the baby's heartbeat, and it was way low, like half of what it should be, I think. I don't exactly know, but half or less of what it should be per minute, like the heartbeat per minute. So they called upstairs to the birthing, whatever, the labor and birth section of the hospital. And then they said they got me on a wheelchair, and they ran us up, and I was realizing something is wrong. Up there, whatever, it was fast, everything. Checked me out a little bit and run into surgery. They didn't wait for whatever papers they usually wait for. They didn't give me an epidural like they usually do. They put anesthesia right into my arm, get me to sleep as fast as possible. I remember just the room filling up with people dressed in green and not finding out more. And then when I woke up later, then they took me to my hospital room. My husband was there after recovery, whatever. We got to the hospital around 2 in the morning, and the papers show that the baby was born at 2:30. And around 4:30 was when they had me in the room with my husband by that time. And he told me we had our first son. But they told us we just barely had him. He wasn't exactly in intensive care. It was in a place called intermediate care. Later, reading the papers, we saw he hadn't breathed on his own for over a minute, and just so many miracles. Like, how did we get there just in time? That the next day, when I was talking to a doctor who was one of the ones who had been there, I don't remember, but my husband told me, well, that's one of the ones who attended you. I talked with him, and he said 5 minutes later would have been too late. And so I called this little boy, my first little son, our miracle baby. We so almost lost him. It has given me a soft place in my heart for people who lose their babies. I thought, what if I had to leave the hospital for my baby's funeral? What if instead of my father-in-law driving, my husband would have driven, and we would have dropped the people off first and then gone to the hospital? It would have been too late. So many things, so many miracles, and I'm just grateful. And that's why I say, if I had to have a C-section after my first or second especially, or with my first or second, it would have been really hard on me. I was learning about natural labor and everything. But by now, I just don't really care. I will carry a scar for life, but I have my son, and I've been so blessed, and I'm so grateful that God allowed us to keep him because he was really God's in the first place. Oh, I forgot to mention that the reason his heart is gone, I was having placental abruption, I think it's called, where the placenta comes loose. It was coming loose before the baby was out. So basically, he was staying without oxygen. And so, by the blessing of C-section, I have a baby. And in those cases, if it had been years ago, I would have died too because I started hemorrhaging internally. It was a hard hospital stay. We had to stay in for 3 days because I needed to be given 3 units of blood. My iron was way, way low. And all that experience was hard physically. It was the hardest thing I've gone through physically, I think, almost. I mean, the labors were hard, the birth was hard, but just for a little while. I think it's good if you study about natural labor and do all you can to have. But if you have to have a C-section, you're not less than. Your baby is a blessing, and we can be grateful. I'm just grateful. I may be grateful it didn't happen my first 1 or 2 because I know I would have struggled much more with that issue of having to have a C-section. But now I can accept it. Earth is anyways not perfect. We will carry scars till heaven. And this scar that I carry because of my son's birth, he's okay. It reminds me of the miracle that I have him with me. And so today, he's 3.5 months old, and I sometimes think, what if we had to leave the hospital to bury him? And here I enjoy his smiles, and I love him, and I'm so, so blessed. So I hope my birth stories could be an encouragement for you, and that you can also accept what you get, how you get it, and that God's grace carry you too in your difficulties. If you lose a child, if you have a miscarriage, if you have to have a C-section you so badly didn't want, if labor is much harder than you thought, and all that. With this all, I also want to say we are not entitled to the birth of our dreams. We sometimes feel that we make birth plans, everything we want it to turn out perfectly. But we're not the ones who control it all. And another thing that I want to mention is just having an ideal birth doesn't mean you're blessed, or less than ideal birth means you're not blessed. I think of Mary in the Bible, of Jesus' mother. She was called highly favored by God. He loved her, and yet her child's birth was much less than ideal. In a stable, alone, a king born that way. I don't think that having a less than ideal birth means that you are much less than ideal, or your baby. I think now of my pregnancies and my labors, and like I said, they weren't maybe the hardest, but they were hard. But I have these 4 little blessings that I enjoy so much, and I would not trade them for anything. And so it's worth it all. And I hope that you can enjoy your children and the blessings that God has given you. And if you don't have children and you would have desired them, I pray that you will find God's grace and strength to carry you. And ultimately, our lives are in God's hands, and He is the one who decides what happens to us. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can enjoy your blessings today. And we'll see you in the next video.